Good morning and welcome to our new This is Revolution podcast, Friday morning show, Fratguy Friday. This is your normal man of the Mile Mile Hour and normal co-host of This is Revolution podcast, Pascal Robert. And I have my co-host, my good friend, Jeff Kennedy. And before we get to the nuts and bolts, I'm going to give you my personal tags, if you will, my fraternity info, and I will ask Jeff to do the same. And for those of you who are not familiar with black fraternities and sororities and Divine Nine organizations, what some organization called the tags is the following. My name is Pascal Robert. I played spring 1987 at the mighty psychotic do or die Xi chapter, Hofstra University, key number 707. I was number 3 on the line of 4. My line's name was Eternal Warriors, a member of Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity, as I stated. My co-host, Jeff Kennedy, was having a little bit of a technical difficulty with his camera, but he is here. Jeff, can you give everyone your tags, please?
Greetings, everyone. This morning, I am Jeff Kennedy from the Epsilon Zeta chapter originally pledged at the Epsilon Zeta chapter of Omega Psi Phi. That is East Carolina University. I am number 2, spring 84. So I precede Pascal by just a few years in this Divine Nine world. Excuse me for not showing my face this morning, but we're having some little difficulties in our first show, but we're going to work those things out. East Carolina University and the mighty UC is a very interesting place, and we're going to get into a little more in a few minutes about why we pledged and who we are.
Absolutely. For those of you who remember, Jeff is the This is Revolution podcast expert and specialist on eugenics, which I'm sure on Frat Guy Fridays we'll be mentioning down the line in various subjects. But today we have a subject matter that's going to be interesting to talk about. But before we get to the subject matter, I'm going to ask Jeff a question, and I think he's going to reciprocate because I think it will give insight to the audience. And shout out to the audience, the fans, and the chat. It will give insight as to who we are. Jeff, can you tell our audience, since you are the old head, you spring 84, I'm spring 87, I got to show you deference. Even though it's a different organization, I still believe in deference amongst the Divine Nine. What made you choose to pledge Omega Psi Phi fraternity at East Carolina? And what semester were you in college when you pledged?
I pledged Omega Psi Phi in my second semester of my sophomore year. In the second semester of my sophomore year, I'm originally from Washington, D.C. I attended East Carolina. I was also playing football at the university, and my entire upbringing was around members of Omega. My godfather was a member of Omega from the University of Pittsburgh, and that's who I spent the majority of my time growing up with. So my understanding of the fraternity and the brothers who were at this particular school, we had very good relationships. I think my cousin was dating one of the bros, so we were all socialized together. They had a house off campus, so when they had events, we would get together. And I never thought about pledging anything but Omega, even though I had good relationships with the other fraternities.
Okay, awesome. So it was kind of a family affair. You have been surrounded by men of Omega Psi Phi, and they impressed you so much, and you felt it was a natural fit for you, and that's what made you decide to pledge in your second semester sophomore year, spring 84.
Yes.
All right.
What about you?
Well, I pledged my second semester freshman year at Hofstra University, and I have a kind of interesting story about that. I grew up, as you know, my parents are from Haiti, so I had no one, at least growing up, going to Catholic school that were run by nuns or the Franciscan monks as teachers who were members of fraternities and sororities of the Divine Nine. But what a lot of brothers who did not know is that I have an older cousin. Shout out to my cousin Lucy, who's about 5 years older than I am, who actually pledged Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority at University of Miami. When I was about in the seventh or eighth grade, me and my mother came down during spring break to Miami to visit my cousin Lucy and her mom. And I was, this is before I was in high school, so I was like 12, 13 or something. And my cousin Lucy takes me on a ride. He said, "Hey, Pascal, you want to go on a ride?" I said, "Sure." She takes me to her campus at University of Miami. And she takes me to this event that's in a very serious room. And there are all these women there, and they're talking about this organization. It's a presentation. And I see all of this paraphernalia or whatnot. I was like, wow, this is really impressive. This is really cool. And one of the women that was there, she comes to me. I'm a little boy. She said, "Pascal, I'm sorry you had to be here to see this. This is kind of boring. I wish we could have had something better to do." I was like, "Are you kidding me? This is great. I love this." So I'm walking out with my cousin as she's taking me to the car. I said, "What was that?" She was like, "Oh, that's a sorority tea or rush." I was like, "What's a sorority?" I said, "Well, she said it's an organization for women." First question I asked her, "Do they have that for boys?" And she said, "Yeah, they call them fraternities." From that point on, I didn't know which one I was going to be in, but I knew I was going to be in a fraternity. So I went through 4 years of high school, not knowing what I was going to study in college, not knowing what my major would be, but knowing that whenever I got to college, I was going to be in a black fraternity. I didn't know which one. So I graduated from my Catholic high school at St. Francis Prep. I went to Hofstra University. The first day I hit campus, I walk outside. I see two men standing between two dorms. One of them has this kind of like burnt thing on his arm. For some reason, something told me, I think these guys are in fraternities. So I walked up to these two guys and I asked them, first question I asked them, no lie, Jeff, "Hey, you guys have any fraternities on this campus?" And they said, "Yeah, we have, Kappas, we have a couple other fraternities." They didn't mention their own fraternity. I said, "Well, what fraternity are you guys in?" I said, "Oh, we're brothers of Alpha Phi Alpha." I said, "Oh, really?" And then they said, "You a freshman here, right?" I said, "Yes, I am." And then the one guy said, who had like the burn on his arm, he said, "Listen, man, young brother, you a freshman, you too young to care about this stuff. Why don't you get your grades up, work your grades up, and you come see us next year? And then, maybe we could talk about, introducing the other fraternities." My chapter had a policy of not accepting freshmen to pledge. I said, "Well, that's what you think." From that day on, every day of the week, I visited every brother on campus and said, "Tell me what I got to do to pledge Alpha." The brothers told me, "You annoyed us so much that we said, I don't know what we're going to do if we don't put this kid online, but we're going to put him online." They put me online my second semester freshman year with three other guys. We started at 6, with ended with 4. And that's how I became an Alpha at Spring 87 at Xi chapter at Hofstra University. And that's the
All
truth.
right. Well, it's interesting how your story was a much longer version than my little story. But let's get into the subject matter. And I'm looking at the comments in the chat, and people are wondering, are we live or is this pre-recorded? And they need to realize that this is live. So we're actually seeing your comments as they pop up on the screen. And one of them, I'm definitely not going to mention it. I think you can see, but
I see.
if you want to take that on,
I'm not going to take that on. But anyway, I'm sorry.
Okay.
But
So
listen,
let me just say this. So we're two older frat guys.
yes,
we are not. Both of us have been in our respective fraternities for over 35 years.
that's
I think
correct.
that's about right. That's right. So both of us have been in our fraternities for over 35 years. Why we call this show Fratguy Friday is because even though we have been in our fraternities for over 35 years, politically and just as members of the Divine Nine, me and Pascal have a kinship. I appreciate this brother's brilliance when it comes to analyzing difficult difficult subject matter. When it comes to his academic endeavors, when it comes to his analysis of politics and of people. So, that's why I agreed to do this show, Frat Guy Friday. I thought Frat Guy Friday was just a pretty good name. So I'm not stuck on the Divine Nine or as a member of fraternity. And when Pascal described me as a eugenics specialist, I specialize in race science, not just eugenics, race science, which is more in depth than just eugenics. Eugenics is a part of that particular race science. So I was an early childhood teacher for over 33 years in the District of Columbia. And I've attended multiple graduate schools. So, we're here today to chew it up, to share with the audience, to, find out what's on your mind, and also to discuss this issue that we're having today. So, Pascal, do you want to talk about the issue and how we're going to actually do the format of the show?
Absolutely.
Pascal, 1 week will choose a topic that he wants to chew on and chat up. And the next week, I'll choose a topic that I want to chew and chat up. And one of the things that I enjoy about Pascal is neither one of us are going to sit here and pontificate or talk about something that we haven't thoroughly researched. When we're actually doing this show, it has a research base. Both of us are, pretty, are professionals. So we're not just sitting here blithering nothings that you see on a lot of different podcasts that have no academic value or no historical value whatsoever. It's just somebody's opinion. So that's my spiel. So Pascal, you want to take us into the topic for today?
By the way, I want you to know, Jeff and I are close friends, and we're not close friends because we're in fraternities. We're close friends because we have a similar interest in subject matters and respect each other's intellects. And the fraternity affiliation actually was secondary to what brought us to recognize each other. But we realized that we both have similar critiques. Maybe mine are more extreme, but we have critiques of the Divine Nine and fraternities and sororities, but both of us have affection for our organizations and the others as well. The subject matter today is something that some lay people in the audience may not be aware of. But basically, the civil rights movement that launched Black America into the later end of the 20th century was heavily populated by members of Black fraternities and sororities. And I will start with the prestigious men of Omega Psi Phi, who often don't get their due as leaders of the civil rights movement, because oftentimes people always try, particularly my fraternity brothers, try to brag and act like it was only alphas who led the civil rights movement, which is not true at all. One of the most important consultants to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in advising him not only on the March on Washington, but on strategy overall in the civil rights movement, probably one of my favorite members of Jeff's fraternity, because he started as a radical socialist and communist, even though towards the end of his life he got conservative and had some problems, but we'll get to the best of him. Bayard Rustin, Omega Psi Phi, plays at Wilberforce University, was very much an important part of the civil rights movement. Next, we have Roy Wilkins, who was president of the NAACP, was also a member of Omega Psi Phi. I believe he plays at University of Minnesota, was the stalwart lead of the NAACP during the civil rights movement. So those are the two very heavy hitters in the civil rights movement who were men of Omega Psi Phi, who had heavy leadership roles that many people would not be aware of. In terms of the civil rights movement and Alpha Phi Alpha, yes, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was an Alpha. He pledged a Sigma chapter at Boston University. Yes, Thurgood Marshall was an Alpha. He pledged at Bloody New chapter at Lincoln University. And we also have Whitney Young Jr., who was head of the Urban League, also pledged Alpha Phi Alpha. So the point I'm trying to make is that much of the higher tier leadership of the civil rights movement was populated by members of what we call divine non-fraternities and sororities. But at a certain point in the movement, particularly towards the mid to late 60s, in 1966, a new call came about by a man named Kwame Ture. Some of you guys know him as Stokely Carmichael. And that call was the call for Black Power. And that call for Black Power shook up the traditional civil rights establishment, and many of them were dismayed because they felt that it would disturb the relationship that the civil rights establishment had with the political institutions. One of the things that happens is a consequence of the Black Power movement that incorporates much of the rhetoric of Malcolm X before, who was very much the kind of ideological and spiritual father of the energy of the Black Power movement, even though he had died a couple of years before, is that a new kind of radical militancy took life among Black college students in undergrad. One of the consequences of that militancy is that they started to believe that these old line civil rights organizations that had been working towards integration were accommodationist, they were lackeys for the establishment, and anything affiliated with those civil rights leaders were frankly what they considered house Negroish or Uncle Tomish. And what they also included in that was fraternities and sororities. So as a result, because not only many of the leaders of the civil rights movement came out of these organizations, because they were part of organizations like the NAACP, the Urban League, SCLC, and so on and so forth, the Black Power rights, particularly starting with the development of the Black Panther Party, and the students and undergrad, as they start to become more culturally nationalist in their accoutrement, afros, dashiki, back to Africa, revolutionary nationalism, Marxism, internet challenging imperialism. A lot of these things that was discussed by Malcolm X starts to become the cultural discourse on college campuses. And these organizations that were considered to be middle class, petite bourgeois establishment, be part of it, part of the man's institution, were considered to be Uncle Tomish, house Negroish, and it got so bad that the popularity of these fraternities and sororities dropped so much that for a long time, for a few years between the late 60s and the early 70s, there was a crisis of membership in these organizations. The first question, now I talk long enough, and Jeff is not going to let me pontificate. Jeff, I would like you to.
Yeah, I'm not going to let you keep going on and on and on and on.
But I want to pass it to you. I want you to. I got to get back. I want you to address the politics of the time, and do you think the Black Power rights were legitimate in their criticisms of the Black fraternities and sororities that started to develop with Black Power and the Black Panthers from 66 up until about 72 or so?
Let me say this right off to our listeners, and this is our first show. This particular subject matter is one that Pascal is passionate about, as you can see. How many minutes he just went on and on framing the conversation. But this particular conversation is one that I think is interesting. And I think it's interesting from the question that he wants me to answer, which is around Black Power from 1966. And if I'm correct, Pascal, and how it affected the membership of respective fraternities and sororities the reduction of a membership in particular fraternities and sororities. My understanding of that particular period of time was everything during Black Power was up under a lens. Most of what I know from that particular period of time, I think I was about 3 or 4 years old at that particular time, was learned from people like Dr. James Cone at Union Theological School, people like your frat brother Cornell West, my mentor Dr. Jeremiah Wright, individuals, my pastor Dr. Dennis Wiley, my former pastor Dr. Dennis Wiley, and a lot of these civil rights leaders who I met, which was most of King's lieutenants, and including the King family. So that's where my understanding and most of my background comes from, knowing first from the secondhand account of what was going on in the late 60s. This particular topic is one that is an interesting one to ponder. But I'm approach it from this particular standpoint. When we look at the class basis of what was going on in the 60s with Black folks, when we look at, we were just coming out of debt peonage in the 1940s. We were just being integrated in the 1950s. We were still dealing with redlining. We're still dealing with redlining even today. You had a class, or sometimes first generation, sometimes second generation black students who were at Black colleges or who were at PWIs, and
Define PWI
had to say it again. PWI.
Yeah,
predominantly PWI. Predominantly white institution. So, and they were new pretty much to these campuses, even though we can go all the way back to the late 19th century and see that there were a few Black members, few Black students at Harvard, Yale, different schools. So in any kind of measurable way, in the 60s, this was the first time that a percentage, a large percentage, whether that largeness is 5% or 10% or 7%, of students would come outside of the little smattering that was done in late 19th century, all the way up to the 60s, Black students, at predominantly white institutions. But at Black colleges, fraternities had been flourishing since 1904, Sigma Phi. Sigma Pi Phi was started. So those fraternities and these fraternities at that particular time, from my understanding and from the scholarship that I've done and speaking to other members at that particular time, they were seen somewhat as classes, as somewhat elitist. They were supposed to, at that particular time, pick out the best of the best and go by their own individual mottos of their sororities and their fraternities, and particular actions that they were taking for basically the Black community. As we know, in looking at class status in America, sometimes that project didn't necessarily work out that way. So that is how I look at this particular this particular project, did Black Power actually reduce the people who were pledging? Did it make? I guess the question that you're asking is, did Black Power actually make fraternities and sororities less popular, or did it empower people to join fraternities and sororities and become more radical? That is the framework of the question that I would attempt to answer. I think that the real question is, did the people who joined the fraternities and sororities, did they try to make them more radical than what they had been previously?
That's a very good question. You know why it's a very good question? I remember an image that I have. I think I have it somewhere on a computer. Of this is a picture of a chapter of a chapter of Alpha at Michigan State in the late 60s. These guys were all wearing their Alpha paraphernalia. Every brother in the picture had a shotgun and a machete in the picture. And I asked someone about this picture. I was like, why do all these guys, are they going hunting? They were like, nah, man, they were on campus. They were trying to fight to get a Black Studies department at the school. And they tried to take over the dorms. I say, alphas are generally known to be kind of conservative, kind of more work within the system. I was like, hold on, you tell me that the alphas at Michigan State in the late 60s were taking pictures with shotguns and machetes because they were trying to take over the student center because they were demanding Black Studies at the school? And they said, yeah, that's what the picture of. I was like, whoa, okay. So to your point about the potentiality of Black Power increasing the militancy of the membership of these organizations, I take that to be the case as well. But I also do know, and I know this because I've talked to not only executives in my organization, but members of the other organizations and people who pledged around that time, that particularly because of the fraternities and sororities and the Vietnam War, because of Black Power and the Vietnam War, there generally was a membership decline. As a matter of fact, I sent you a couple of articles from the Washington Post. I know you don't like the Washington Post, that talked about how in some organizations it wasn't until the late 70s that there was an increase in popularity. And we both know that the 80s was like the glory days of these organizations. Now, what's interesting to me, right, is that I pledged in 87, you pledged in 84. I got pledged from brothers going back from 79 all the way down to, right before me. So brothers from your era, which is a few years older than mine, made me as well. So we are contemporaries in that regard. What was the factors that caused what was a slight decline in interest in the late 60s to early to mid 70s to become a boom in interest, not only in the late 70s, but in the 80s, the popularity of these organizations explodes. And the question I ask is this: why do Black fraternities and sororities in this period, with a 50-year counter-revolution, during the Reagan years, one of the most conservative periods in American history that's considered to be most racist, why are these Black organizations flourishing under Ronald Reagan? What do you think is causing that, Jeff?
Well, I was in school during Ronald Reagan, and I'm gonna have to go back to my history at East Carolina University. At East Carolina University, I ended up the general manager of the minority newspaper called, which I turned into the Expressions. And on campus at that particular time, this was 1982 to 1986. And I'm sharing everybody so everybody can figure out my age. They can, basically talk about us old frat guys, us older frat guys, during 1982 to 1986, during the Reagan years. It was it was a culture shock, one being at a PWI, but it was one that I expected, not to the extent that not to the extent that the culture was different. Myself, I grew up in DC, so I had always been affirmed in who I am as a person. I was always taught how bright I was, how smart I was. I was always taught, always made a big deal of me as a student. So there was never any question about could I go to this PWI and be successful. And matter of fact, my freshman year, I was one of two students uh, entered into the freshman honor society at the university. I had like one of the highest GPAs on campus. And what was interesting about that was, and I don't want everybody to think that I was so smart or so brilliant and coming into college. What was smart was I had an advisor who looked at the system and said, if you take all these difficult classes that they're recommending the income freshmen taking, you're going to have the same result, which is going to be the fact you're going to have, academic struggles. So he gave me a mixture of classes that would keep me in line with graduation and also give me the required hours that I needed. And in taking that mixture of classes, I ended up with one of the highest GPAs on campus. So I wasn't going to take two sciences and two maths at the same time. And then the other thing you had to realize about PWIs at that particular time was, they were highly racist. I mean, these folks, it was just off the chain. And I'm trying to figure out, where did we get these people who considered themselves to be white, who were just so academically talented that they were so much smarter than everybody else? And it wasn't the case. It wasn't the case whatsoever. So I'm sitting in class with them. I'm sitting in honors classes, honors history classes. And I'm sitting there and, and I'm, of course, the only Black person in class. And they're discussing these topics, and they have absolutely no scholarship behind the topics that they're discussing. And I have the confidence at that particular time to say, wait a minute, and to challenge anybody, except the professors. I was smart enough to know that if I wanted to get out of this PWI, the last thing I was going to do was run around and challenge professors and end up with low grades. So you had to be very strategic in taking on even that white college that you know about too, because you went to a PWI. You had to be very strategic about how you took on those professors, because you could very well end up in a situation where you were out of school because they had dropped your grades, and then you were going to have to go through this particular grievance process. And you knew the point of the exercise of being in college was to gain knowledge and to graduate so that you could go on and help the Black community. But I already had a sense of, coming in as a freshman, that I was going to do things while in school to help the Black community. I already had that sense. What I was struck by was in Eastern North Carolina, the segregated system that people were coming out of, and how the culture was completely white centered. I'm coming from DC. I'm coming from DC, being around mostly African American and mostly African Americans in the time when Marion Barry was the mayor. And now I'm in Greenville, North Carolina, walking the campus. And my first walk the campus, I started noticing the white students would take up both sides of the sidewalk and they wouldn't move. So I, being from DC, I just realized that, I'm not getting off no sidewalk. They just going to run into somebody who at that particular time was about 185 pounds and had 3 or 4% body fat and was playing football. And after a couple of people went down on the sidewalk, they realized that when I walked down the sidewalk, they needed to move. I mean, they needed to make space. And so it was just a complete social situation where blacks where the whites believed they had come from these little or these situations where I don't know how many blacks they had ever been around. I don't know how many inner city blacks they had ever been around, where they believed that they were superior. And so I was my freshman year in college. I'm sitting there trying to figure out, why do these students who academically clearly are not more capable than I am think that they're superior? Where are they getting this stuff from? Where are they getting these thoughts of superiority, of white superiority from?
What's interesting, Jeff, is that when you talk about this experience, you know what I started to think about? I'm starting to think about the founders of my fraternity, Alpha Phi Alpha, because one of the main reasons that they justified why they felt they needed a fraternity is that the racial hostility on campus was so bad that they felt that they needed a unifying bond amongst themselves to give them solace to confront the racism they were dealing in. And this is in 1906. And you're talking about at East Carolina between 82 and 86, the racism was so bad that even though you had already had interest in Omega, it kind of even deepened your understanding of a need for a fraternal brotherhood that basically gave you even more understanding of the legitimacy as to why you wanted to be part of an organization like that. Is that kind of where you're going with that?
Yes, absolutely. And the other thing that really drew me to Omega, and the alphas on campus were also doing some very interesting leadership things. The thing that drew me to Omegas was these were nonsense brothers who took care of scholarship, but they weren't trying to fit into the mold that the respectability mold that so many others on campus were trying to achieve. They didn't, my fraternity brothers on campus at that particular time, they didn't give a damn about respectability. And for me, that's what drew me. We had the newspaper that I was ended up as the general manager of. The campus was trying to wipe it out every single year until I became the general manager. After I became the general manager, I turned it into a magazine that actually won 2 top awards in the country for journalism in 1 year. And the first edition that was published, it actually won the top award on campus for most improved. And from there, I started entering it into contests all across the country. And I think and let me talk a little bit more about that. What I found on campus at East Carolina University, it was much like the Washington Post here in Washington, D.C., where Black people were invisible. And it was like, we have to have some Black people on campus. So why doesn't the main newspaper, campus newspaper, which is the East Carolina at that particular time, how come it doesn't talk about Black folks? It only talked about the white students. And I was like, oh, this is some Washington Post stuff. So when I took over as the general manager of the Black newspaper, that was predominantly for minorities. No, and at that time I took it over, it was for Blacks. They didn't have to say nothing about no minorities. I highlighted what was really going on campus and highlighted the Black students. And that allowed me to bring in all the different organizations that we had on campus, from the NAACP to an organization we had called Souls, from the ECU Gospel Choir to all the fraternities and sororities. And I highlighted students from each one of these organizations and show, how we were interacting at East Carolina University with the larger community. And what was interesting, if you may give me a second, Pascal, to talk about that, was I didn't do it from a perspective of everything is so wonderful and peachy for Black students at this university. One of the first things that we showed was the little cultural center that at this rich university that that they had allowed us to party in, and it was a disgrace. It was a little shack on sitting on the side of the main campus, and that is where we're supposed to have all our cultural events. So we brought attention to that, and the university, of course, wasn't appreciative of it. And to be truthful, if the university had any idea, if they had one idea that I was going to do and produce the work that was created back in 1985, talking about East Carolina University and the articles, and allow these students to produce their work. To today, you can go back and look at that particular magazine, Expressions Magazine in East Carolina University in 1985, and the issues that we talked about back then are still issues that are germane to right now. And the university had no idea that I was going to allow these writers to express themselves freely and also take jabs at the university. And so when I entered into the Associated College Press national conference, it was out in LA, California. When I went out there for the conference, and this was in the spring of, I think, spring of 1986. When I went out there for the conference, the professors and the individuals who ran the Associated College Press at that particular time, they were just struck that in Eastern North Carolina, that someone could produce something they considered to be radical at that time, talking about Reagan, talking about gay students, talking about economic conditions on campus, how many Black administrators and professors were at the university or weren't at the university, the housing conditions for Black students. And they marveled at the fact that I could get the university to pay for this. But what they didn't know, Pascal, let me say this last thing. What they didn't know was the university had no idea when they appointed me that I would do this.
I'm glad you said that. That's fascinating. That's a testimony to your integrity as a student and your tenacity and desire to accomplish things. And a shout out to you for doing that. But it also demonstrates how the training you got in your fraternity in terms of skills and leadership help you level up your game to do that. But let me go to my college experience between 1986, fall of 1986, where I entered Hofstra University, and the early 90s when I leave, and spring 87 when I pledged. I also was coming in the tail end of the Reagan administration. But what was fascinating to me in my era was how so many Black people who were on the Cosby tip were feeling like the Black middle class had arrived. As a matter of fact, in August of 87, the year I pledged, if you look at the cover of Ebony magazine, there's an issue, the new Black middle class. Are you in or are you out? So what I was seeing was there were a large growth of Blacks in Ivy League schools. We used to go to step shows in Ivy League schools. It was during the racism of the Reagan administration, but I was seeing a lot of people coming into these colleges and the explosion of popularity in Black fraternities and sororities. But I will also say that because I went to Hofstra University and they had this program at Hofstra called the NOAA program, New Opportunities at Hofstra, that was really a kind of Black conscious kind of higher educational opportunities program, there was always a very strong kind of more Black nationalist focus on race. So many of the brothers in my chapter had come out of that program. I was not a part of that program, but I used to go to their functions. And every Black History Month, they would bring out people like John Henry Clark, Joseph Ben Yakiman, Gil Noble, all of these, Ivan Van Sertima, all of these Afrocentric academics that people watch on YouTube today, I used to see these guys as an undergrad from 18 to 21 at Hofstra all the time, take pictures with them, ask them questions, debate them all the time. So I was immersed in a period of new interest in Black cultural identity. And there was also a radicalism that was inspired by a type of new militancy caused by this phenomenon called hip hop. In other words, the whole kind of stop the violence and culturally aware hip hop, 5% influence hip hop coming out of New York, which was very influenced by Black nationalism. I would say there was a certain kind of militancy that was very common amongst Black students in my undergrad years. And I remember, I'm contrasting, remember the scene from School Days where you have the guy, Dean Big Brother Almighty, is confronting Dap, and he says, I am a Greek. I'm from Detroit, Motown. I don't know anything about Mother Africa. I found that comical because on my campus, some of the most African conscious people on campus were the members of fraternities, particularly the Alphas. The year before I came to Hofstra, the Alphas sponsored one of the biggest anti-apartheid protests on the campus at Hofstra University. As a matter of fact, African cultural awareness was one of the things that attracted me to Alpha. Because one of the things I said is that how come you have 9 Black fraternities and sororities and there's only one that has Black in their colors? And it was the Alphas. And that actually made sense to me. And, all of the Egyptology as well. I was like, there's nothing Greek about this organization. There's clearly African origins here. So for me, coming out of those years of Catholic high school where I was denied any kind of cultural kind of embellishment, growing up watching Like It Is and Gil Noble, all that celebration of Black radicalism and African consciousness, that also was a thing that greatly caused me to be turned on and appealed to the nature of not only fraternities and sororities, but particularly Alpha. But all the organizations had a certain militancy and cultural awareness at that time. So I do agree with you that there is a militancy that these organizations can cause amongst their students, particularly. And this, by the way, Jeff, there's a strong theme in terms of similarity between me and you here. Both of us pledged at predominantly white institutions.
I think that's important because let's go back to the founding of Alpha, and let's go back to what happened before the founding of Alpha to the Black students at Cornell. The Black students at Cornell were summarily dismissed. A large number of the Black students, they didn't have a large number, but of the Blacks that they did have, a large number of those Blacks were dismissed from Cornell University. So the Alphas, and if I'm incorrect about this, let me know, the founding members of Alpha to survive these PWIs said that we need to get together and we need to collectively join to deal with what was going on at society at that particular time.
That's why Alpha starts as a study group. It starts literally
as a study group. And remember, in the beginning of the 20th century, what a lot of people don't understand with the founding of these fraternities and sororities was that Blacks weren't thought of as being human. There was race science going on, and they were saying that Blacks were less than human. And so now you have these individuals who are college students who are being college educated, and they're systematically having to fight to remain on campus. And it didn't matter whether it was at Cornell, it was systematic across the country. They had to prove why they needed to be educated, why they needed to learn a social curriculum, why they needed to have a classic type of education, and it goes back to Booker T. Washington, who basically was saying that No, the only things that blacks in the South needed was the type of education that's going to allow them to keep the type of jobs they had during slavery, agriculture,
industrial education, sharecropping.
industrial education.
Yep.
Right. And so that led us to an educational system that still remains with us today, where we have these debates about who it is that we are as fraternity members and in Black America, who we are as sorority members in Black America. Who is this group called the Divine Nine? And what is their relevance to the politics in today's society? Even with Kamala Harris being the vice president of the United States right now. So for some people, that is a shining example of the advancement of these Divine Nine members.
I want to pivot from that.
Yeah, so talk about that for a second. Go ahead.
Now, this is where I come in, and this is where we might have a divergence here. My thing, as much as positively as I've spoke about my experience in Alpha and how Alpha is what gives me the cultural, intellectual connection to Black history and Black political thought that allows me to what I'm doing today. That's a fact. I am supremely critical of the Black fraternity and sorority movement and project, going back to Du Bois, going back to Sigma Pi Phi, going back to the Souls of Black Bolt, going back to the Talented 10th, going back to Alpha Phi Alpha, Omega Psi Phi, Kappa Alpha Psi. Because as we said in our prior video, these organizations were stimulated as a consequence of Du Bois in 1903 writing both The Souls of Black Folk and the Talented 10th as a reaction to the industrial education that Booker T. Washington is proposing that would make Blacks subservient to white capitalism. And he is sending out a call to arms to elite educated Blacks or university educated Blacks to say, we can't let this kind of education stop us from fighting for our race, if you will. We must uplift the race as the Talented 10th, and he didn't create that term. He got it from a former president of Morehouse who was talking about the 10% of Blacks who were free men of color during slavery, that they must uplift the race. I believe that the concept of racial uplift is classist because it assumes that the people who are poor and working class Blacks, who are the supermajority of Blacks now and were the supermajority of Blacks then, somehow need us as college educated Negroes who are generally aspiring to be nothing but compradors and collaborators with the white power structure, to be able to teach them how to lift up their pants and apply for a job, when working class Black people like the Colored Farmers Alliance, like Hubert Harrison, who was not college educated, autodidact, was a socialist. You had the Cyril Briggs. You had Black socialists and communists and radicals who were creating solutions for working class Black people who didn't depend on college-educated Negroes. And what I'm saying is that oftentimes people from our organizations created political solutions that worked to their benefit as a class and to the detriment of the class of the majority of Blacks who are poor and working class. And I would
jump in.
Go ahead. You want to jump in?
Let me jump in right here, Pascal, because remember, I wanted to discuss real quickly the mottos of each of the fraternities and sororities to give an understanding of our listeners of why they were created. And if you listen to the mottos of each of the fraternities and sororities, it will give you insight. Can you say, just for the record, what is the official motto of Alpha Phi Alpha?
The motto of Alpha Phi Alpha is, first of all, the first Black fraternity, servants of all. It will serve everyone. We shall transcend all. Through service to humanity, we will lift ourselves as brothers of Alpha.
Okay, so then we have Alpha Kappa Alpha, who was founded in 1906 at Howard University.
1908.
And their motto was by culture and by merit. Then we had Kappa Alpha Psi, who was founded at Indiana University, and their motto was training for leadership since 1911. Then you had Omega founded at Howard University in 1911, and their motto was friendship is essential to the soul. You had Delta Sigma Theta, which was incorporated in 1913, and their motto was transforming communities through sisterhood and service. So you can hear this service and these particular mottos, which led to how they saw themselves as serving or operating as an organization. You had Phi Beta Sigma, was created at Howard University, and their motto was culture for service and service for humanity. You had Zeta Phi Beta, which was founded at Howard University in 1920, and their scholarship and their principle was scholarship, sisterly love, service, and final womanhood. Then you had Sigma Gamma Rho, which was founded in 1922 at Butler University, and their motto was greater service and greater progress. And lastly, you had for the Divine Nine, out of Iota Phi Theta, the Brothers of Iota, and they were founded in 1963 at Morgan State University, and their motto was building a tradition, not resting upon one. And that last one is something I had to dig into a little bit. Why would the Iotas say not resting on a tradition? So the question is, did they feel that the rest of the Divine Nine or the rest of the fraternities, at least in the Black community, weren't building a tradition, but they were talking about, they were resting upon what they had done in the 1911s, the 1920s, the 1910s, the 1920s, or the 1930s, or the 1940s. So how we view this particular project and these individuals who are part of this fraternity sorority situation. I'm watching right now, and one of my neighbors is going in the house, and it's raining outside. She has her Delta Sigma Theta umbrella, and right next to her is another member of Delta, and she lives directly across the street from me. So on my block alone, I mean, there's probably about, or at least the street that I live on, there's probably about, of the 15 houses, there's probably about 10 fraternity and sorority members that occupy those 10 to 15 houses in this particular community that I live in, Tacoma, in Washington, D.C. So that is somewhat how these organizations have grown. But I asked you specifically about Kamala Harris. And we sort of running out.
I want to make a correction. I think the Kappa's motto is achievement in any field of endeavor, in every field of endeavor, if I'm not mistaken. I think that's their motto. I'm almost sure it is. Kappa Alpha Psi.
Okay.
I believe it's achievement in every field of endeavor. My position on Kamala Harris is that she's a
member. My apologies to the Kappas.
What do you say? Yeah, shout out to the Kappas.
My apologies to the Kappas.
Not a problem. My position on Kamala Harris is that I don't see her as something we should probably be proud of, because I believe that the Black political class is the result of the training. Let me make this clear. The training ground of the Black political class are Black fraternities and sororities. That's where you learn your parliamentary procedure. That's where you learn to network. That's the way you learn to organize a meeting. That's where you learn how to do minutes. That's how you learn how to structure a function. That's how you learn how to rent a hotel for a banquet. All of those skill sets, which are valuable skills that we learn in our organizations, fraternities, and sororities, is the training ground for the Black political class, which has risen up in the post-civil rights era, that has governed and lorded over Black poor and working class people. Kamala Harris, from David Dinkins to Charlie Rangel, my own fraternity brothers, you name them, whoever they are, Jesse Jackson, you name them, have governed over the 50-plus year counter-revolution in a way where the class differential among Black people has gotten worse than it's ever been before, and sometimes that black managerial class has sponsored mass incarceration, deindustrialization, charter schools that gut public school teachers' jobs, and horrible policy that affect poor and working class people and are a buffer class to act as social control of poor and working class people to the benefit of the ruling class. I say that as an over 35-year member of Alpha Phi Alpha. I love my organization, but it does not mean I'm going to lie about what I think the way these organizations work. Can they be radicalized? Can they be transformative? Can they have a better purpose and do better things? It's very possible, but because of the lethargy, which is a fancy word of being asleep, of the class politics, I think that they're more go along and get along than fight along.
Well, that was the critique that many people, that Martin Luther King had of the fraternity. Remember, Martin Luther King was extremely critical of Alpha, and not only Alpha, of fraternities, period.
He was an Alpha.
This particular Black middle class that we're actually going to talk about, I'm quite sure, at length in other shows. My take on Vice President Harris is, I met her, I think it was in the spring of '86 at Howard University. And what I found to be remarkable, what was remarkable about her, and I never forget meeting her, because and let me just be clear, this was back in the fraternity days, and she was a little cute thing. Let's not get that confused. And I'm standing there talking to her, and she's saying at this particular time, when I first met her, what her plans were for life, what she wanted to do for life, that she was going to move to California, that she was going to move back to California, that she was going to go to law school, that she was going to go into politics, and all the different things that she wanted out of life. And this was the very first time I had ever met that sister. And she's telling me from the first moment I met her exactly what her plans were for life. And it always struck me of how focused she was. And I was always attracted and driven to people who wanted to be successful and who were focused. And so I would check in with her line sisters, because I'm friends with quite a few of them. They some of them were dating my best friends, and I was dating a couple, I was dating maybe somebody, close to them. And it always struck me, what was this sister doing in her life? I was always watching to hear what this sister was doing in her life. And so to see her where she is right now, that was something by design when she was, back there at Howard University in her early 20s. This is not something that that came about.
Yeah, come on, man. She played the political game, man. Come on, Jeff. Really?
1 second. This sister decided that she had a vision for her life that she would articulate the first time that you would meet her. And she stayed on that path, and whatever she had to do,
Jeff,
to stay on that particular path.
Jeff, I've been surrounded by careerist petit bourgeois Negroes my whole life who knew from the first day of high school what they would be and did it. They had the class training to do that. Of course she did. Her father was a professor, man. She ain't up and
having a father be a professor doesn't mean that she was going to be successful. I know plenty of people fathers who are professors, and they couldn't barely graduate from high school.
Listen, I'm not trying to diminish the woman. I'm not trying to diminish.
You are. Listen,
I'm not trying to diminish. I'm not trying to diminish the woman.
What I'm saying is, regardless of her politics, Pascal, she had a vision about what she wanted to accomplish in life, and she stayed the course. And for a lot of children, a lot of young adults who are growing up, they need to establish at a very young age what it is that they want to do in life and stick with the course. And that is inspiring. I'm
Oh,
not
so,
saying
so we're gonna go
anything
with the
about her
role model thing
neoliberal
now.
politics.
We're gonna
Wait, wait,
justify
wait,
the
wait,
black.
wait. No. I'm not saying anything about her neoliberal politics. I'm not saying anything about some of the positions that she's taken. I'm not saying anything about her performance in California as a politician. What I'm just saying is she, just like many other people, decided at a very early age a course that she was going to take in life. And she stuck to what God or what she think her purpose was.
Yes.
And that will help not only people who are in fraternities and sorority, but for all our listeners and all,
Yeah, her purpose is to
and
be a
for all the
confidant
people
and
listening to this
collaborator.
conversation.
She's a
Yes.
collaborator for the system. She's a class enemy. She should be fought. That's what her purpose is.
Well, and that is the position. That is the position that some people take. Some people don't necessarily like her politics. Don't Some people don't necessarily like uh, uh, who she projects to be
It's not just
as
her.
a
It's not
person,
just her. She has
as a person.
It's not personal. The job of the black political class, no matter who they are, is to protect the system, man. And black people get ground to powder by the system. And if you're protecting the system, you are the enemy of the majority of blacks who are being destroyed by it, and you should be fought. Period.
I think now, see, we're getting into another conversation, and we're actually going to have to end because
Yeah,
we're at an hour.
we're already over an hour.
Yeah, we're at an hour and 7 minutes, and this might take us into might take us into our next conversation. Are black people, as a class, the protectors of or the black middle class, particularly, are they protectors of capitalism and the system of white superiority that we have in this country? Are they the protectors of that? Is that their role, and why they have been allowed to achieve in certain aspects of this country? That's something that we need to talk about on another show. But I think it's an important conversation because it mixes into the fraternities and the sororities, how certain people get opportunities and other people don't get opportunities. If you look at the fact that many times, I never forget a woman, actually my former pastor, and I never forget this conversation. She talked about why she got opportunities and her mentor didn't get the same opportunities. And she's like, my mentor is a lot more qualified than I am. Why didn't she, get these opportunities I got? And for me, it was a very easy answer. It was a very easy answer from the standpoint of her mentor could build alliances. And by bringing her into an organization, she was going to transform the entire organization. Meaning, by bringing this one black person into an organization, the organization was going to be multicultural in about 5 to 10 years, just by bringing this one black. But by bringing in my former pastor, she was a little more. She wasn't as bridge building and bringing in other individuals of her particular race, and she was going to be sitting there 5 years in and saying, "Oh, I'm still the only African American in this organization." And so, who do white people hire? They hire the individual who doesn't necessarily have the organizational skills to transform the organization. And that happens over and over and over again in our communities. And this is done intentionally just to get that one black representational individual in an organization is something that these people who are doing the hiring, they're thinking about constantly. They're thinking about, I don't want to bring in somebody who's going to transform this organization. I like the organization the way it is, focused in on capitalism and white folks. I'm not trying to bring in any individual who doesn't have that same mindset. So when we start talking about Black achievement and fraternities and sororities, they're picking from this particular crop of individuals, just like you just said, to think about, okay, who is it that I hire? And they're going to be the person at the door making sure that they say for the rest of this organization, oh, we're not a racist organization. We're not discriminating against Blacks. And we're not doing this because we have this one Black person who represents all this stuff that we are doing. And they speak well of us.
Right on. Well, listen, Jeff, we're over an hour now. This is the first episode of Fratguy Friday. Please like and subscribe, leave a comment, ring the bell, join This Is Revolution podcast. We will be here next week, Friday, and you will check the notification to find out what our subject matter is that Jeff will choose. Jeff, I hope you enjoyed our first episode. I think it went well. I look forward to further episodes with you and hopefully having some guests along the way as well. And we at This Is Revolution podcast, Fratguy Fridays, are